You think about someone all the time, and it's gone far beyond what's normal. It doesn't matter what you're doing. They show up again, like an automatic, repetitive, insistent thought. It may have been someone you shared something meaningful with, or just a brief exchange, a glance, a simple conversation. Even so, they take up too much space in your mind. It feels inexplicable, but it's not. According to Carl Jung, this doesn't happen by chance, and it's not necessarily about love, longing, or emotional attachment. When someone lives in your mind with such intensity, it usually has deeper roots, not in the story you had with them, but in what they represent to you. The emotional content of this presence can be a kind of signal from your unconscious, and Jung didn't see the unconscious as a dark box full of forgotten traumas. To him, it was a living field where forgotten parts of who we are continue to try to express themselves. When you can't stop thinking about someone, that persistent presence might be revealing a part of yourself that was rejected, forgotten, or never developed. The mind is not a neutral stage where thoughts pop up at random. There's a symbolic system at play all the time, and the person who keeps showing up in your mind is there for a symbolic reason. They're like a messenger, and the content of the message is often you. This mental obsession isn't an illness, a lack of focus, or just emotional neediness. It's the surface of something that's trying to rise, something you might have ignored for too long. That person might represent a life you wish you had lived, an emotion you've repressed, a courage you never allowed yourself. They are there as a symbol, as a bridge between who you think you are and who you truly are. Jung said the human mind is a labyrinth. You can spend years walking in circles until you realize that the repetition has a function. The person you can't forget is like a fixed point in that labyrinth, and the more you resist, the bigger they seem to grow inside your head. This isn't random. It's structure. It's psychic language. And the sooner you understand it, the clearer the path back to yourself becomes. Because deep down, when someone won't leave your mind, what's trying to emerge isn't the other. It's you. It's your shadow, your hidden desire, the rejected part of your story. And that's where things start to gain depth. The mind doesn't repeat for no reason. It repeats to be heard. And when you listen carefully, the other person stops being a mystery and starts becoming a mirror that reveals that what you see in the other is often exactly what still needs to be recognized within yourself. And from there, everything changes. Jung believed that most of what we experience doesn't happen in the conscious mind, but in the unconscious. And when someone begins to dominate your thoughts, they've probably activated something far deeper than the surface, something that lives in the hidden layers of yourself. This inaccessible part of the mind isn't just any place. It's where unlived desires dwell, aspects of your personality that were suffocated, unresolved wounds, and also forgotten possibilities of who you could have been. The unconscious, in this sense, acts as a living system of compensation. Everything that is repressed by consciousness, whether due to fear, shame, obligation, or social convention, eventually finds a way to return. And one of the most common ways is by projecting itself onto another person. You start thinking about them, remembering them, idealizing moments that never even happened, feeling like there's something left to understand. But in reality, what needs understanding isn't the person, it's what they stirred in you. Often, the one who occupies your mind is touching an unhealed wound, maybe something from childhood, a moment when you felt rejected, invisible, or incapable. And this mental presence seems to trigger exactly the same pain, as if pressing on an old bruise, only now it comes in disguise. You can't recognize the source, but you feel the effect, that anxiety, that ache, that urgent need for answers. Other times, that person represents a quality you haven't yet developed, someone spontaneous, free, creative, bold, everything you silenced in order to fit into molds, rules, and expectations. And now, that quality shows up in the figure of someone outside yourself, as an uncomfortable reminder of everything you stopped being. Jung said, people make their unconscious complexes live in others. That's exactly what happens. The person enters your mind because, in some way, they're already part of your psychic structure, not as they are, but as they resonate. This process is not rational. You might know the relationship no longer makes sense, that this person is no longer part of your life, that you shouldn't be thinking about them anymore, and yet you still do, because logic isn't what's at work. The unconscious is operating through symbols, and until you translate that symbol, until you understand what this presence means within your emotional system, it keeps coming back, not to punish you, but to show you. Thinking too much about someone might be an unconscious attempt to integrate something you haven't yet had the courage to face. And what's curious is that even when pain is involved, longing, rejection, abandonment, the mind stays stuck, because it's not about liking the person. It's something more primitive, the desire to resolve what was left unfinished, not outside of you, but inside. Jung reminds us that the psyche is always seeking balance, and when something is missing from consciousness, the unconscious tries to compensate with symbols, symbols that appear in dreams, in repetitions, in sudden passions, or in people who show up like riddles. The mind doesn't miss the target. It repeats what needs to be resolved. This repetition isn't punishment, it's a chance to stop looking outward for answers and begin looking inward for what's really missing. The person in your mind is just the tip of the thread. What's pulling it comes from much deeper. And when you start to follow that thread with sincerity, you may find a part of yourself that's never had a voice. From the moment you recognize that this person activates something already inside of you, one of Jung's central insights begins to emerge. The shadow. This is the name he gave to all parts of your being that were rejected, denied, or repressed throughout your life. Not because they were bad by nature, but because at some point they were judged as unacceptable by you or by those around you. The shadow may contain anger, envy, jealousy, fear, insecurity, desire, but it can also hold power, freedom, sexuality, creativity, courage, all the things that didn't have room to grow in a healthy way. Jung said, the shadow is everything a person doesn't wish to be, but he also said, it's the doorway to real self-knowledge. Because as long as you keep fighting what you don't want to see in yourself, you'll continue seeing those parts in others. And that's exactly where the person who keeps living in your thoughts comes in. Often, they represent something that belongs to your shadow. If you feel an almost obsessive admiration, perhaps this person is embodying a quality you've suppressed, like confidence, boldness, or pleasure. And if you feel irritation, contempt, or even anger, maybe they're mirroring traits you haven't yet accepted, like selfishness, coldness, or vanity. That's why some presences leave such a mark. They're living mirrors. They don't reflect who you are today necessarily, but who you could be, who you fear to be, or who you have yet to integrate. And the unconscious mind recognizes this. Even when the rational mind denies it, the unconscious insists. It returns. It repeats. Until you look. It's not easy to face your own shadow. There's shame, guilt, resistance. We grow up hearing that certain emotions are ugly, that certain desires are wrong, that certain impulses must be hidden. But what is repressed doesn't disappear. It turns into shadow and reemerges in indirect forms, like obsessive thoughts about someone, like emotions you can't explain, like patterns you can't break. Jung said, you do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This means true growth comes not from escaping the shadow, but from integrating it. And that integration doesn't happen theoretically. It starts precisely in those moments when someone on the outside touches a wound on the inside, when someone makes you feel small, insecure, needy, or inferior, not because it's true, but because it's activating something that was already there, hidden. That person's constant presence in your mind might be a call for reconciliation with yourself, a call to look more bravely at the parts of you that were left behind. Once you understand this, everything begins to change, because instead of feeding the obsession, you begin to investigate what it's trying to show you. And then, your relationship with that mental presence stops being a burden and becomes a key. Beyond the shadow, Jung identified two other fundamental archetypes that also influence our emotional obsessions, anima and animus. These represent, respectively, the feminine principle within the male psyche and the masculine principle within the female psyche. But beyond gender, they symbolize internal aspects present in all of us, like intuition, sensitivity, strength, rationality, empathy, and both the creative and destructive impulses. During psychological development, we don't always manage to integrate both sides. Many times, they remain unconscious, and that's precisely why we end up projecting anima or animus onto other people. The unconscious mind seeks outside what hasn't yet been acknowledged inside. Jung said that in such cases, the other becomes a guide of the soul, a symbolic reflection of everything trying to emerge from within. That's why, sometimes, we're taken by an almost inexplicable fascination with someone. It's not really about the person themselves, but what they symbolize. They might seem like the perfect partner, the soulmate, the love of your life, even if there's no real basis for it. This happens because your unconscious is projecting onto that person traits it longs to integrate. You feel like they have something special, almost magical, but what's really happening is that you're seeing in them an undeveloped part of yourself. For example, a man who denies his own sensitivity may feel magnetically drawn to a woman who expresses it freely. A woman who repressed her assertiveness may deeply admire a man who shows power and direction. In both cases, what feels like desire for the other is actually a desire for reconnection with the self. And the most challenging part is that this can create emotional confusion. You think you're in love, but what you're seeing is a piece of yourself that's been lost. That's why Jung warned about the dangers of projecting anima and animus. When you idealize the other, you stop seeing who they really are, and you also remain blind to what's inside yourself. The other becomes a screen where you project your emptiness, your desires, your forgotten archetypes. This idealization, in fact, is often one of the main fuels for mental obsession. The less clearly you see the other person, the more the unconscious fills in the blanks with fantasy. The person starts living inside of you, taking up thoughts, emotions, and time, even without being physically present. And this energy only grows the more you avoid looking at what's really being projected. Jung called this process archetypal inflation. The projection of anima or animus inflames the psyche, creating an intense emotional charge that feels like love, destiny, or spiritual connection. But often, it's simply the soul asking to be seen. What's missing in you, what was forgotten or denied, is trying to manifest, and it found in that person a symbolic way to appear. That's why the path is never about repressing the feeling or running from it. It's about dissolving the illusion, learning to see the other more clearly, and most importantly, learning to see yourself more deeply, because what you're looking for in them may be exactly what you haven't yet awakened within yourself. And until that's recognized, the obsession continues. When anima or animus are projected onto someone, it's easy to fall into idealization, but there's a more common and more dangerous mechanism: psychic projection. Jung said, "What you do not face within yourself will come to you as fate." In other words, everything you avoid recognizing inside, you end up projecting outside, especially onto the people who affect you most deeply. You begin to see in the other qualities that are actually yours, or flaws you don't want to admit in yourself. You admire someone's courage, but maybe you're ignoring your own. You're irritated by someone's pride, but maybe you carry the same trait, just more hidden. And this projection is so natural that you believe you're seeing the other clearly, when in fact, you're looking at yourself disguised as someone else. That's why some relationships are so intense. Even without logical sense, the other becomes a mirror, even if a distorted one. They reflect parts of you that you don't recognize. And the intensity of that projection feeds the obsessive thinking. You get stuck on an image that's not real, but deeply symbolic. And the most curious part is, this works with both people you love and those you reject. Projection doesn't choose affection, it chooses impact. The problem is, while the projection is active, you can't see the other clearly. Worse, you can't see yourself. Jung called this moment a symbolic crisis. The psyche tries to grow, but it's trapped in projected images. The only way out is to withdraw the projection, to realize that what you see in the other is often yours. And that shift takes courage. because it's easier to hold on to the illusion than to face what it hides. The mind insists on someone because that person is serving as a screen, and the more emotionally charged the situation is, the stronger the projection impulse will be. Real freedom begins when you start separating what belongs to you from what belongs to the other. When you realize that obsessive thinking isn't really about the person, it's about what they reveal in you or force you to confront. And sometimes, that confrontation is exactly what you've been avoiding your entire life. After all this, you may have started to see that the person who keeps showing up in your thoughts is not the problem, and not the answer either. They're the reflection, a symbolic, psychic, emotional reflection of something inside you that hasn't yet been fully understood, accepted, or lived. When someone takes up that much space in your mind, it's common to look for rational explanations. You might think it's longing, neediness, unresolved love, an unfinished story, or even a mistake you made. But none of that by itself explains the intensity of the repetitive thought. What Jung showed us is that the unconscious doesn't speak in words. It speaks in images, symbols, repetitions, and when a person becomes recurring in your mind, they're symbolizing something. They become a doorway. That doorway leads directly to what Jung called the individuation process, the journey of becoming whole. But that path only opens when you start pulling back your projections, when you realize that what you see in the other might actually be yours, your unintegrated shadow, your denied sensitivity, your repressed strength, your abandoned freedom. The mind insists on someone because, in some way, that person represents what you still can't face or claim as your own. It's as if they hold the key to something forgotten, and the intensity of the mental obsession doesn't come from the person themselves, but from the symbolic weight they carry. Maybe they represent a life you wanted to live, but never had the courage to. Maybe they activated a part of you that had been asleep, or maybe they function as an emotional mirror for ancient wounds, wounds that weren't healed in time and now return, using their face as a disguise. And this can happen with anyone. Someone you knew briefly, an ex who's no longer in your life, someone you never even shared anything real with. That only confirms that what holds you captive isn't the other, it's what they awakened. Repetition is a language of the psyche. It's like your mind saying, "Look at this. There's something here." And while you try to silence or rationalize this call, it returns, not because you're weak, but because you're still blind to an emotional content that needs to rise to consciousness. The obsession only dissolves when the symbol is deciphered. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And that darkness often shows up in the form of someone you can't forget, not to torment you, but to push you back toward yourself. The journey begins when you stop asking, "Why can't I forget this person?" and start asking, "What are they trying to show me about myself?" That shift in the question is everything. It moves the focus away from the other and brings it back where it belongs, inside you. It's not about forcing someone out of your mind. It's about understanding why they're there, what they're carrying, what part of you is expressing itself through their presence. And from that, allow the learning to unfold. The other in this process is just the mirror. The real encounter is with yourself.